Hello, everyone. I got motivated this morning and decided to do this recording as a gift to my friend Joy, who invited me yesterday to their yoga class, particularly a yoga session that was meant for instructors. And they talk about chakra, and I learned a great deal. It's a topic that I've been thinking about quite a bit, and as you know, last week or the week before, I even talked about the relationship between yoga and what we've been calling the chi therapy. So I thought I maybe I should kind of put all my thoughts together and do a better job. So I gave it a title of today's talk as I called it the 8 limbs of chi therapy. So of course, this is quite an audacious title. Many of you know of the 8 limbs of yoga. And so one of the things I wanted to do today is really, when I look at that list of the 8 limbs of yoga, it really combines everything that we've been doing here in this class, everything that I've been learning from various Buddhist masters. And it's really amazing how much similarity there is between what I would call the traditional or spiritual yoga and the Buddhist training. So before I get started and talk about these 8 limbs, but from the context of chi therapy, I thought maybe I should really talk about yoga first, or at least my understanding of yoga, to put it in some kind of context. So when we talk about yoga in America, it's similar to talking about soccer, American soccer, or American Chinese food. What we talk about in this country, when we say yoga, we really meant hatha yoga. Hatha means force. So yoga as it's practiced in this country, for the most part, is a set of physical activities. It's really meant as replacement for other physical activities. And there's very little spiritual practice in that. I'm not saying that there isn't, but most of them is not. In fact, I talked to friends of mine who take yoga classes, and I try to see if they understood things like energy and meditation, and I said, that's not talked about. But in any case, I went back, and this is something I knew for a while, and I went back and tried to understand what hatha yoga is, or at least how it was developed in India before it got popularized in the West, particularly in the United States. It turns out that what we call hatha yoga is actually rather new. It's only about 1,000 years old, and it was basically a fringe activity. In fact, hatha yoga is not at all popular in India. And it focused more on what's called the asana, the physical postures. And interestingly, the idea behind hatha yoga is that they believe the essence of our life is stored in our brain, and as we age, that those essence are leaked out from our brain. In fact, they are exhausted through our stomach. So the more we eat, the more we would deplete these essence. And the worst thing you can do is to have it escape your body in the form of semen. So what they try to do is they try to reverse that process by doing quite a bit of upside down postures. And in fact, if you can see here, there is something called there's a posture that they do, something called a mudra, not hand gesture, but where they actually take the tongue and they curl back into the nose as a way of stopping the fluid coming down through the brain. And so to practice Hatha Yoga means that a man should abstain from sex, right? Because that's the one thing you don't want to do, is to let semen leave the body. Implicit in that is that they believe that Hatha Yoga is meant for man, because what they call Baidu, the essence of life, includes the menstrual fluid as well. And so they actually think that Hatha Yoga is not something that was meant for women, because women is, look, this is thousands of years old. Obviously it's politically incorrect, but they believe that women are inferior and therefore they should not be practicing Hatha Yoga. This is all for men. Kind of interesting. So this is physical yoga. This is what's popularized in the West. But if you go back to India, when you say yoga, it's really spiritual yoga. And so when you say spiritual yoga, it's mainly named after a person, Patahani, who was born about 400 or 500 years after Christ. So it actually predates Hatha Yoga by another 500 years. And he was really the first one that actually wrote down the practice of yoga. And in fact, he's very famous for not just what he wrote on yoga, but also on there's another book that he wrote that is on the grammar of the Sanskrit language, which is still used today. And then there's something else that was attributed to him, although it's arguably, it has been argued that maybe it wasn't him, it was someone else with the same name. But in any case, the third set of literature that is attributed to Patani has something to do with I believe it's called Verda. It's a very old technique of health maintenance, right? And lots of people study that. So, but going back to the Yoga Sutra, the main thing that he talks about is something called Ashtanga, which are the 8 limbs of yoga, which we will talk about today. And so people who study the spiritual yoga, they would often mention the 3 P's. The first P is the person who wrote it down, Patanjali. Then it's really the difference between the physical and the metaphysical. The physical, everything that you see or sense, is called pragati, and everything that you cannot see that are metaphysical, that has much to do with the mind, is called purusha. So the group that I was invited to is called the Purusha Yoga Association. And that's where it comes from, is to really go back to the root where yoga was a spiritual practice. It was actually much more for the mind than it is for the body. The body is just a conduit to the mind. Now, the word yoga, I'm very interested in this. I've been really reading up on it out of curiosity, and there's a yogi that's very popular right now in India and outside of India, and he talks a great deal about Shiva, who was the original yogi. Supposedly lived either 6,000 or 60,000 years ago. Nobody really know. So, in fact, yoga is English word. The original word is either yuj or yuja. Interestingly, the Chinese word for yoga is, the traditional one is actually yuche, which is exactly yuja, the Indian word. And the meaning of the word is yoke. It's what you put in front of 2 oxen as they pull the cart, is to synchronize and harness them. So yuja or yuj really meant the harness of the body and the mind and putting them in synchronous. It's the oneness of the mind and the body. So one would argue that all spiritual practice, wherever it's practiced, really came from that. It really came from that. Came from Shiva. And Shiva, as you know, is a god in the Hindu god. He's one of the three gods. So in the Eastern culture, it's not one god. They actually divide up their duties, and so these three gods have, one is the creation, that's Brahman. One is really the administrator, the preserver, and so that in the Chinese culture, that would be the Jade Emperor. One would argue that the historical Buddha was actually incarnation of Vishnu as well. That's people talk about that. And finally, Shiva, often called the destroyer. I don't believe that this destroyer is a proper translation. I think he basically represents impermanence. In other words, there's nothing in this world once it's created that would be permanent. Everything comes together because of conditions, and everything breaks apart because of condition. That is the basis, really, of the Buddhist teaching, is that there is nothing permanent in this world that is a material world. Now, interestingly, he has many wives, but the two that are well known, his first wife is called Sati, and his second wife is called Parvati. Now, in the past, I talk about Sati, and Sati is the name of the goddess. And let me just quickly tell the story that one day a king and a queen came to her and asked for a daughter, and the goddess became the daughter, incarnated into being the daughter, with one condition, which is that they need to promise her that they would never disrespect her. If they do, then everything would be taken away from them. In any case, this princess Sati grew up and was in love with Shiva and actually married Shiva. And the parents were not happy with that, and one of the birthday party decided not to invite her, but she came anyway, and she was very upset. And she basically says that I told you not to disrespect me, and since you disrespected my husband, you have disrespected me, and the promise that you made is now broken, and I remember that. And so she jumped into the fire and went back to being a goddess. And of course, needless to say, the queen and the king lost everything. So when the historical Buddha needed a word to represent mindfulness, sati was the word. It's really, once you made a promise, you remember. And so mindfulness is just to remember. And so when we practice mindfulness meditation, that's what it means, is that you're mindful of every breath. So before you take a breath, you essentially promise yourself that you would anchor your mind onto this breath from the beginning to the end, and then you do another one and another one like that. Or you can anchor your mind onto your body. Interestingly, yesterday in the class, Joy said something about mindfulness. She didn't use the word sati, mindfulness being the foundation of yoga, and that is absolutely true. That is absolutely true. Now, so when she went back to being a goddess, then she then went back and married Shiva again, and she became the second wife, and that's Parvati. And once they were married, she was very, very interested in Shiva's practice, and actually became his first student and learned everything there is to be learned from the yogi practice. And it's only after that then Shiva eventually have the 7 disciples who went to the 7 corners of the world, and so again, all the spiritual practice that came after that can arguably trace back to one of the 7 disciples. So in summary, the Shiva's teaching, which was first propagated by Parvati, has to do with something called the 5 koshas, the 74,000 nadis, and the 114 chakras. So let me talk about this one at a time because they have great significance to what we do in what I call the chi therapy. First of all, koshas are like the layers of existence. They're like the Russian Tao. There's the one in the middle, and then another one outside, and another one inside. So the concept here is that our body is just a physical body. That is just one of the 5 dimensions of our existence. It's just the food that we consume. You have a banana, it's a banana. If you eat the banana, it becomes your body. So your body is just a banana. And your body is just a banana that you borrow from the universe. And when you die, you return back and it might become a banana again or might not. But the point is that the body is transient. And it's what you have in this lifetime. And it contains all your senses, the eye, the nose, the tongue, the ear, and the skin, right? The one beyond that is called the mental body, or it's sometimes called the intelligence body. The idea is that every cell in your body is capable of some kind of intelligence. Particularly the spiral cord is where all the nerve ending comes together, and then eventually it's delivered to the brain. The brain actually is not the entirety of your intelligence system. It's the intellect, it's not the intelligence. Then you go beyond that, and that's the energy body. And then you go beyond that, and that's really the transitional body. Sometimes people call, or you may even call that, perhaps this is where the karma rests. It's a record of all the actions, mental actions that you have in your lifetime and the one before that. And then finally, when you get to the inside, is the bliss body. Is where you are no longer suffering from you're no longer burdened by your physical existence. So those are the 5 layers of our existence, and the Chinese have a little bit more simplification of that. Let's go beyond that a little bit. And so now we can talk about the nadis and the chakras. The nadis are the middle one, which is the energy body. And so the teaching according to Shiva is that we actually have these energy lines within us, these energy channels, and there's 32,000 on the left side of the body, and then there's 2,000 on the right side of the body, for a total of 74,000 energy channels. And then every time these channels come together, the intersection takes the shape of a triangle, or in a 3-dimensional way, it could be a sphere, and those are called chakras. And it's thought that we have about 114 chakras. Now, the chakras are not the same as the energy points in the Chinese tradition, so I want to make sure we understand that. The chakras are not even, they're much more than the body. They're actually an opening to another world. So through these chakras is where you could practice and be emancipated by your physical existence and be in the spiritual world. These 114 chakras, supposedly 2 of them are outside the body. The remaining 112, supposedly 4 of them are somewhat automatic. So you're left with 108 chakras. And for mortals like you and me, we can only access 7. So these 7s are essentially along the spiral cord, starting at the very bottom of the upper torso, go all the way to the top. And of course, some of that has some relevance or relationship to the Chinese understanding of these energy points. For example, the very bottom one probably corresponds to what I've been calling yin meat at the very bottom. The second one obviously has something to do with dantian, right below the belly buttons. And then finally, in between the eye is another one. But again, it's not that you shouldn't draw the conclusion that they are energy points. They are not. They are really opening to the spiritual world, something that is beyond my comprehension. I mean, it's if I tell you anything about it, I'm just making it up because I obviously have not reached that point. Now, so those are the nadis and the chakras. Something that nobody talks about is that Bodhidharma, no, not Bodhidharma, I don't mean Bodhidharma, I mean the historical Buddha, Gautama Buddha, or after he became enlightened, his name is Sakamori, he was a yogi. In fact, he lived before Patanjali, right? Because he was born about 5 or 6 centuries before Christ. So quite a bit before Patanjali. And he was a practicing yogi. He was born in Prince in what is today Nepal, what was before was basically North India, in the foothill of the Himalayas. He decided to renunciate at the age of I believe it's 39. Now that I look at it, it might have been 29. No, it's 39. 39 is correct. And then he was a yogi. He practiced as a ascetic for 6 years. Those are documented. He had 2 yogi teachers. The first one he was able, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but he was able to attain what's called the sphere of nothingness. He was not happy. He was not satisfied. Then he got another teacher, very famous teacher, and he was able to attain slightly beyond that, which is called the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception. And then he decided that was not enough. And he sat down. The famous story was that he sat down under the Bodhi tree and vowed not to leave until he can find the path. And what he was doing, he was looking for one of the chakra that allows him to emancipate himself from the shackles of the material world and become a pure spiritual being. And it was only after that he returned, and when he returned back to his 5 disciples, who were basically his bodyguards. They were sent by his father, the emperor, to protect him, but then also became fellow practitioner, and he taught these 5 disciples and many like him the basics of what is now called Buddhism, but actually they're yogi practice. And this area, this period it has always all written down, no, not written down, but it was passed orally, and then eventually it was written down. And we call this the period called agama. Gama means leaving, because the story was that after he gave up on the ascetic path, the 5 monks thought that he had given up and actually left him. And so Gama means left, and then Agama means come back. So he asked them to come back, and he taught them. That period is called Agama period, and he taught very basic teaching, all in Pali language. And you can actually, in the Pali Sutra, find lots of references to the yocha practice. So yogi, Buddha was a yogi, and so for me, a lot of my learning is considered Buddhist teaching. So I'm not that far from the yogic practice. Okay, he was a yogi. Now, the second person, and before I even talk about that, I think it's important to really talk about what does it mean to reach the realm of nothingness. What is that all about? So in both, this chart actually didn't come from the Buddhist teaching. This actually came from the yogic practice, and they basically separate our world. So if you think about our universe, once it was created after the Big Bang, we have what is called the desire realm. This is what you and I know, and the humans is there. Below the humans are what's called the hell realm, above, and then also what's called the hungry growth realm, and then also the animal realm. And so those are the three realms that are below the human, and then above the human is the diva realm, and there are quite a few of those, 6 of those. And all that is considered the desire realm. This is the realm where we still are confined by our physicality. And once you can escape that, then you go into what is called the rupa realm. Rupa means form. And then if you can go beyond that, that's called the formless realm, the arupa realm. And so as a practicing yogi, their goal, their objective is to escape the desire realm, the kama luka, and be in the rupa luka or the arupa luka. And so the historical Buddha, as a yogi, actually was able to reach the very, very top. Those two are, one is called the Realm of Nothingness, and the other one is called the Realm of Perception and Non-Perception. So he was definitely a yogi. All right? Okay, so now, and all his practice are basically, yogic based. Now, he added a few things, and we can talk about that. The other very famous Buddhist is Bodhidharma. And Bodhidharma was also a yogi. He came from Eden, India. Now, of course, he lived almost 1,000 years after Buddha. And before he came to China, he was very famous for coming to China. And before he came to China, he was, in fact, the 28th patriarch of the Buddhism in India. And then after he came to China, we now think of him as the first patriarch of the Chinese tradition, the Chinese Chan tradition. Now, Chan is abbreviation of the word Jhana, which is basically a translation of the word Jhana. Jhana, and I will talk about this in a minute, but Jhana is the rupa realm, okay? And of course, Jhana becomes Jhana, Jhana becomes Chan becomes Zen. So when you talk about the Japanese Zen meditation, that's where it came from. Now, he was very famous for secluding himself in a cave for 9 years, and that cave is actually in the hills behind what is today the Shaolin Temple. And so a lot of what we call the Shaolin martial art actually came from that. And it was derived from 2 set of writings. And one is called Yi Jing Jing, and one is called Si Sui Jing. And Yi Jing Jing, if you translate literally, means the renewal of tendon. And the Si Sui Jing, if you translate literally, means the cleansing of marrow. Now, in the past, I talk about how these, I believe they're mistranslation as well. But in any case, our chi therapy make use of both of these, okay, in various form. And by the way, if you look at the word Yi Jing, it sounds almost the same as yoga, because one is yuja and the other one is Yi Jing. Very similar. One more thing so anyway, I argue that the exercise that we do in our class has its origin in the yogi practice, because it came from Bodhidharma. Because another very famous person is a person by the name of Lu Daobing, who lived about 200 years after Bodhidharma. And before Bodhidharma, the Taoists, they were practicing alchemy. So when we say Dan Tan, Tan means the field, Dan means the pill that you swallow. And they were practicing external Dan, because Dan came from something that they would refine as alchemy. And then once Bodhidharma came, then the Chinese learned how to meditate. Then all of a sudden the Taoists, they went from external Dan to internal Dan. So 9 Dan becomes internal Dan. And so again, so Bodhidharma has great influence over China, over the Chinese Buddhists, Chinese Taoists, the Japanese Buddhists, and so forth. And the technique that he brought to us is what we practice today. Now, I think it's important that I talk a little bit about my own master. My own master is Master Jiro, and I wrote about him, I talked about him in the past. And he's a very interesting person, very unusual in that he's not just a Dharma master, he's not just a Buddhist, he's also a martial artist, and he's also a traditional medical Chinese medicine doctor. He was born in 1961, so he's quite a few years younger than me, and he's 62, 63 today. He was born in Malaysia. His family came from China. But he himself was born in Malaysia. His grandfather, who came from China, actually joined the revolution in the early part of 20th century. The revolution was 1911. So he was old enough to join the revolution. He was something like a bodyguard or a military leader working for Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And eventually the overthrow of the Qing dynasty. There's a very famous memorial site in south of China, Canton, where they memorialized 72 martyrs. Half of them came from Malaysia. So that's how much support Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the father of modern China, was receiving from Malaysia. Master Jiro himself grew up with his father, and at the age of 5, his grandfather. His grandfather was teaching him martial art, and eventually included Yi Jing Jing. So when I talk about Yi Jing Jing, I learned from Master Jiro, and Master Jiro initially learned it from his grandfather, and his grandfather was a martial artist, a Shaolin martial artist. Then eventually, around late teens or maybe in his early 20s, he had an opportunity to go to Thailand, and he became a monk. He renunciated in Thailand in what is called the Theravada tradition. That's a southern Buddhist tradition. And after 6 years, he decided to return to Malaysia, and then he renunciated again. Now he practiced in the Mahayana tradition. Now, interestingly, some years later, he had an opportunity to immigrate to the United States. He now runs a monastery in St. Louis, of all places. And somewhere along the path, he met with a very famous Chan master who at the time was living in the East Coast, was actually the chairman of the Chinese Buddhist Association in the East Coast, and had 2 temples that he was a leader of. And Master Jiro had been the abbot for both temples. And one day, Master Mingqi decided to teach something to Master Jiro, and the story was that he demonstrated once, and then quickly Master Jiro was able to master it, and Master Mingqi was flabbergasted. How can you learn so fast? And Master Jiro says, "Oh, I learned it from my grandfather already." So the Yi Jing Jing, the practice, the yogic practice that come from Bodhidharma, was taught to Master Jiro twice. Once by his grandfather, and the second time officially by Master Mingqi. Now, it's very important to say that, because the next chart kind of busy chart, but on the very top is the historical Buddha. On the very bottom, on the left hand side, is Master Jiro. So on one hand, he was ordained in the Theravada tradition, which has an unbroken chain, right, going from Bodhidharma to Master Jiro. Interestingly, he was also ordained in the Mahayana, the Chinese tradition, particularly learning Yi Jing from. Now, Master Minchi came to the United States in 1949 after the communists took over China, and he was actually the abbot for a very famous temple called the Tinding Temple, and he was the 48th abbot. And supposedly, Yi Jing was passed on from abbot to abbot. And interestingly, the Tending Temple was built by a monk, a crazy monk, called Fa Yong, and who was not the first abbot. He just built it. And then he passed on to the first abbot, to the 48, and so forth. As it turns out, this crazy monk, Master Fa Yong, was a student of the fourth patriarch of the Chan or Zen meditation. So you do the number, then Master Jiro was not only disciples of Buddha from the Theravada lineage, unbroken lineage, he was also the disciples of the Buddha through the Mahayana, the Chinese tradition, also unbroken. In that case, he was the, let me see, so it's 48 plus 1 is 49, plus 4 is 53, and so he would be the 54th disciples, generation disciples, and I would be the 55, and so would you. Okay, just for fun, all right? Now, just for completeness, on the right-hand side is really, because many of us know about Zen Buddhism, and that's really what that is, that it then eventually went to the sixth patriarch, and from that, it became 5 different branches, and one of the one that came to Japan was called Soto Zen, and then eventually came to San Francisco. So that I did that for a different reason. Anyway, now it's time to talk about how the nadis, the 74,000 nadis and the 114 chakras, what is the relationship of that with what we do, because we talk a lot about the 12 meridians and the energy points. You really have to go back a little bit and talk about the Chinese culture versus the Western culture. As it turns out, Galileo is very famous for discovering Jupiter and the influence of Jupiter and the moon on the tide on Earth, and then eventually deduced that it was the Earth that rotates around the sun and not the other way. And for that, he got in big trouble with the church, because the church base his science on the Bible, and in the book of Genesis, it talks about the earth being created first. It was only after that, and God parted the water, that he created the sun and the moon. So it couldn't be that the earth would evolve around the sun. That's not possible. That is just hideous. And so he was put into a home arrest and died while imprisoned in his home. Now that's only just a few hundred years. That's less than 500 years from today. I mean, that's amazing that only 500 years ago did the Westerners decided to understand the planets, as opposed to the Chinese who actually understood it thousands of years ago. Now, there's a cultural difference, because in the West, it's dominated by the church. So there's people are forbidden to learn about the heaven, because there's no such thing. The heaven belongs to God, Whereas the Chinese, the emperor is considered the son of heaven. And so to secure his power, he needs to be the one that understood the most about heaven. So in his employ, he has a large team of astronomers and astrologists. So long ago, we understood that there's a planet called Jupiter. And because you can see with your eyes, and it takes 12 years for the Jupiter to go around the sun. And that's why we have this 12 zodiac. I was born in the year of the monkey. But then they decided that that wasn't enough. That was not enough granularity to just divide our existence into just 12 steps, 12 segments. And they realized that there are more planets than just Jupiter. And with the eye, they were able to see Mars, Saturn, Venus, and Mercury. So they decided that, yes, it took 12 years for the Jupiter to go around, but because there are 5 planets, it actually takes 60 years, not only for the Jupiter to go around the sun, but to have the exact configuration between the planets. And so for a long time, the Chinese believe that there's 60 deities. So it's not enough that I was born in the year of the monkey. I was actually born in the year of the golden monkey, because the 5 planets becomes the 5 material or 5 elements. And the 5 elements are the water, the metal, the fire, the wood, and the earth. And then from that, they deduce a very interesting concept of how, in order for the world, in order for the universe to live in harmony, there has to be these balanced forces between these elements. So, for example, we have one is called like the enhancing interaction, and one is more like the reframing interaction. So, for example, water and wood is, think of wood as a vegetation. Think about how out of all the planets, only the Earth has life because we're the only one that has water. Now you would argue that maybe some other planets have water too, we just haven't discovered. Okay, that's fine. So water is the absolute requirement, is the prerequisite of life. So okay, you start with water. Now, with water, you have some kind of vegetation, maybe algae. Once you have algae, it changes the atmosphere, and now you get more of the sun, and now you have fire. And once you have fire, it warms up the earth, so the soil can support a more complex form of life. So the algae could become simple, grass or plants. And once you have more vegetation growing on the soil, they create mineral, and now the mineral actually adds vitality back to the water. So you have this generating or supportive relationship going from the water to wood or vegetation to fire to earth to metal or mineral, back to earth, back to water again, right? So, but if that's all you have, that's not enough because there's no feedback. And so there is this other reframing interaction between the elements. So for example, the water generate vegetation, but it reframe water, and reframe fire, and fire can reframe metal because it can melt metal, and metal can reframe vegetation because you can cleave the wood, for example, and then wood can reframe earth because you can make dams and prevent mudslide, for example. And then finally, the earth can reframe water. You can build dam, right? So the Chinese really built their entire philosophy of harmony in these 5 elements, and in terms of the yin and the yang. And so in this case, the yang is the solar, is the sun, and the yin is the shadow and the absence of sun. So one is more masculine, one is more feminine, one is more constructive, and one is more reframing. So when we talk about yin yang, it's not two things, it's actually five things all working together. So that's understood. So they understood that for thousands of years. But it was only after the arrival of Bodhidharma that they combined this understanding of the five elements and the yin yang harmony with understanding the body. And they started to associate the five, what's called the yin organs, and similar to the yogic belief, these are the organs that contain essence. So the kidney contains the essence for marrow, and the liver and the heart and so forth. We don't need to go too deep into that. So these are the yin organ, and then associated with that is the yang organ. And again, they have this constructive and reframing relationship in that. So that becomes the basis for the Chinese medical science. But then once they understood how to meditate, then they were able to experience these nadis, this energy field inside of them. And because of their understanding of the astrology and understanding of how life is influenced by the sun and the absence of the sun, they realized that one way to abstract those 74,000 nadis is think about in terms of the what's called the celestial rhythm, that there's energy that flows in our body in the 24 cycles. And so they come up with these 12 meridians divided into yin and yang. The yang energy is what goes to the extremities, the fingers and the toes and the top of the head. And the yin energy is what returns back into the core. 6 yin, 6 yang, making up these loops. And each of the energy lines is active for 2 hours, so they're completely recycle itself in 24. And that's why it is different from the yogic practice, because they took the technique of deep meditation, and they were able to experience not only the body, the outer layer, but also the inner layer, the energy body. And they were able to visualize the flow of energy according to the solar cycle and according to the 5 elements. Okay? But fundamentally, they come from the yogic practice, because Bodhidharma was a yogi, all right? And meditation came from the historical Buddha, who was also a yogi. In addition, they abstract these 5 sheaves, these 5 interlayer bodies, into just 3. So the intelligence part, which is really the brain and the spiral cord, is part of the body. These are all physical. And then all the mental stuff becomes just the mind, not the thinking mind now. The thinking mind is just the brain, that's the body. And in between is the chi, is the energy. And instead of talking about the 74,000 nadis, they only talk about the 12 secondary channels called the meridians, plus the 2 primary. One is called the governing, which runs along the spiral cord all the way to the very top, coincide with one of the chakra. And then the yin is what runs from the front of the body, which is called conception vessel. I usually call it gestation. And then the energy points are what's along these energy lines. They're not so much as the opening to a spiritual world as it is with chakras. Okay, so you can't, it's not, I don't have enough experience nor data to say that they're related, but they're not. Okay, and they're there for a different purpose. Now, let's come back to what I really want to talk about is, again, what I say chi therapy is really everything that I learned from Master Jiro, which has little bit of martial art, not so much, but mainly I Ching Jing, which I believe is a yogic practice, has a lot of breathing practice, which comes from the Taoist, and a little bit on from the yogic practice, has a lot to do with meditation, which comes from the traditional Theravada practice of mindfulness meditation. It comes from all that, but if you were to take what we do and you try to superimpose on these 8 limbs, you would find, for example, the first limb called Yama on the right-hand side is about disciplines, and so that's what we do. Is for example, as a Buddhist, I adhere to the 5. What's that called? The 5 set of rules. First one is no killing. Second one is no lying, no stealing, no sexual misbehavior, and no intoxicants. So that's about how I want to interact with the outside world. I don't steal, I don't cheat, right? I don't lie, I don't even flatter. That's against my set of disciplines. I don't kill, obviously. And then finally, I don't take drugs or any kind of intoxicants. No. So that's it, Then the second one is a little bit more interesting. And so, for example, the group that invited me yesterday is called Purusha Sava. So Sava is similar to another word called Dana. Dana is generosity, is service. I'm not sure that is the distinction, but you would argue that maybe one, it has more to do with financial activity, donating to a church, donating to a cause, whereas the other one, the Sava, has more to do with actually taking what you know and give it back to the society. So I do both, and so these would fall under duties, things that you do. And then the next one is obvious, asana. So the postures is much more than sitting posture. We have 4 postures. We have sitting, standing, lying down, and walking. And everyone is a way to practice. And so in our practice, we talk a great deal about the lotus asana, and the 7 support points of the Varachara. We talk a great deal about that. Then we talk a great deal about breathing, how to practice breathing. We have the 5 breathing exercise. We have the abdominal breathing exercise that we do. Lots of breathing exercise. Then the next one is a little bit interesting. Typically, it says withdraw from senses, which is not what we do. I use the word protocol. The idea that you don't withdraw from your senses, but there's a certain protocol of how you engage with your senses. The senses being the eye, the nose, the tongue, the ear, and the skin, and the brain. Right? Remember now, all that combines into one body. And we talk a great deal about that, which is you need to engage your senses, engage the outside world. You need to examine it. You need to accept it, and then you need to let go. Okay, so one of the things that we do in every exercise session is how when we do the joint exercise, there's certain joint exercises that create pain. It talks about how to examine the pain, engage the pain, and then accept the pain, and then let go of the pain, and don't let the pain metastasize into suffering. So that's what we do. And it's not exactly withdrawal. It's not like you want to just put yourself into a deprivation chamber and not deal with outside world. In fact, that's the difference between what I've been calling the Arahant path versus the Bodhisattva path. The Bodhisattva path really has to do with engaging the society, so you can't shut yourself out like that. But there is a protocol, which is that if somebody says something that you don't like, that hurts you, you embrace it. You engage it, embrace it, understand it, and then you let go of it. Quickly come back to your body. That's what mindfulness is all about. It's interesting that when we talk about the senses, the Chinese translation for the senses is called sense door, a door that opens you to the outside world. But our role is that of a doorman. So when someone comes to your hotel, you're the doorman. You open the door. You engage them. You examine them to see if they belong here. And then you greet them, you accept them, and then you let go. You don't chase them to the elevator, right? Okay. Then the next one is another practice, which is, in Chinese, it means one mind. Is that how do you go from mindfulness to more of a persistent mindfulness, maintaining one, like for example, if you were the mindful of your breath, how do you go from one to the other, and then to the other, and then to another, right? And if you're mindful to your body, how do you do that? And eventually you have enough concentration that it becomes one mind only. Then the next one is really not so much practice, but it is as much as a practice as it is a level of achievement. The first one is called Jhana. And many people use the word absorption. Actually, if you look at the word jhana, it just means a sedimentation. Sedimentation means that you got to get to the point where you're capable of both good thoughts and bad thoughts. And what you wanted to do is, as soon as a bad thought comes, you don't disturb it. It's like how do you clean a glass of water that's full of mud? You don't stir it up, right? Because if you stir it up, and you can't filter. There's because there's too much. And so what you do is you let it settle, and that's what jhana means. It's just let all those what we call the akusala thoughts settle, right? Don't disturb them. That's how you approach tranquility. Is don't disturb them. And finally, there's something called samadhi, which some people call it bliss. So again, it's important to go back to these three realms and really talk about jhana versus samadhi, because again, we as mortals, we live in this realm called the desire realm, which consists of the hell realm, the hungry growth realm, the animal realms, the human realms, and even the deva realm. And we are inundated by sensors, inundated by the desire. Our eye sees color, our ear sees hears sound, and so of course our eye wants to see beautiful things, not ugly things. Our ear wants to listen to pleasant music, not unpleasant music. So with each sensors we create desire. This is what we want, and with desire, we have emotions to. The anxiety, the fear, and so that's the soup that we live in, right? Now, once you practice, whether you do that in the Buddhist way or the Yogi way, in fact, the Buddhist way, is the Yogi way. Then you reach this realm that's called Jhana or the Jhana, depending on if you use Sanskrit or Pali. And it's only after that then you reach the Arupa realm, and that's where that's where you achieve samadhi. The reason I want to mention that is that part of our chi practice, the main reason for chi therapy, as a therapist, we're here to heal, but it's important that we don't judge. We're just here to heal. That's why I like the word therapy. Then you're here to teach exercise, meditation, all that. But it turns out that the best therapy you can have, the best way you can heal yourself, is to go deep into what would be called the bliss body. Of course, we can't get there, as a model, but you can get close. And it turns out that this jhana realm, which has the four realms, the first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana, they are actually what's called the Four Bahara. The Bahara is the chamber. They're actually the four, and when you reach the first one, you have something called a metta. This is what we call loving kindness. The second one is what you call karuna. This is compassion. The next one is, some people call it appreciative joy, empathetic joy, and actually it's just empathy, right? That's what we call it now. And then the last one is equanimity. It's no judgment, non-judging. And so you can actually do a kind of a push and pull model where you go towards the four Brahman Vahara, the realm of the Jhana, by practicing, or you can go by digging deep into your loving kindness. So, in summary, our chi therapy for self-healing is just that. We accept our existence in terms of a body, a mind, and a chi, and we want to develop the chi as a bridge between the body and the mind, putting them together. The very definition of yuja is the yoke, is the harness that you put in front of two oxen to bring them together. So the chi, the energy, is to bring the body and the mind together, and we approach it from the two ends, the push and pull. We start doing exercise, right? And with the exercise, we can relieve trauma in the body, so we can start to really harness the chi. But at the same time, we also do a metta meditation based on gratitude, forgiveness, and then finally loving kindness. Okay, so that's exactly 1 hour. And this is a gift to Joy for inviting me to the group, and I really appreciate it. There's just so much to learn. Okay, thank you.